a cellular level for two different types of cells at the heart. One, the cardiac muscle cell. Okay, this is very similar to the skeletal muscle cell with a few minor differences in the action potential. And then two, the pacemaker cell. So we actually have two different potentials we're worried about here. First, the potential in the cardiac muscle cell. This is an action potential, and then the pacemaker potential in the pacemaker cell. Okay. So let's go over that a little bit. Firstly, electricity is just really what? Exactly, the movement of charged particles. So when we're talking about electrical activity in the heart or electrical activity in cells, you have to keep this in mind. Really, all we're talking about is the movement of charged particles across a barrier, and in this case, we're talking about the cell membrane. Okay, so in order to sort of understand these action potentials, we have to know the setup of charged particles outside of our cell. So does anybody remember what kind of charged particles we have around it inside of the cell? Okay, sodium's where? Outside, okay, that's good. And potassium? Inside, okay, even better. Okay. So this is what I like to call the salty banana. If you ever had me in AMP1, I did refer to this setup as a salty banana. Why? Because you have sodium, which is what you think of when you think of salt on the outside, and you have potassium, which is what you think of when you think of bananas on the inside. However, this is only enough for maybe skeletal muscle and neurons. When we talked about the heart, both pacemaker and cardiac muscle cells have one more ion that we're worried about. Calcium. Calcium is this guy here. So really it's not just a salty banana, but maybe a salty bony banana, right? This bone is what you think of, or calcium is what you think of when you think of bone. Alright, so now the next thing to do is talk about the movement of these charged particles, right? We have this setup here. We know where these charged particles are in high concentration, right? High sodium, high calcium outside the cell, high potassium inside the cell. But electricity isn't just that, it's also the movement of these particles. So in order to know the action potential fully for a cardiac muscle cell, you have to know where these ions are moving and when each one is doing its movement. What we'll do first is set up this graph here. On the y-axis, of course, you have the cell's potential. Okay, what this is referring to is the difference between charge inside and outside the cell. Okay, 0 millivolts would mean that we have the same amount of positive charges inside the cell that we do outside the cell. But of course, we know that's not true for a resting cell. A resting cell ends up somewhere around negative 70 millivolts. Negative 70 millivolts implies what? No, this is where a resting membrane potential is usually. Well, yeah, I mean, there's things happening, but when I say, what's the difference between a cell with a 0 potential and a cell with a negative 70 potential?
They're not even?
Right, it's not even. These charges are not even, but how are they uneven? Are there more positive outside or more positive inside?
Outside.
You're more positive outside, right? You're more negative inside, right? This is what that looks like. A resting cell sort of looks like this, right? You have more positive outside, more negative inside, and therefore your potential is slightly negative, right? Negative 70 millivolts. Now, last class we talked about why this is. Does anybody remember why you start out, or resting membrane potential is negative 70 as opposed to 0?
Is it because you have more of sodium leaving the cell?
Well, sodium's already in high concentration outside the cell, so it's going to want to come in, but we have potassium here in high concentrations inside the cell. Potassium's going to want to leave, right? And it does through these leaky channels, right? I have more potassium leaving than sodium coming in, therefore I have more positive charges leaving than positive charges coming in, and it makes my inside of my cell a little bit more negative, and in fact, it ends up around negative 70 millivolts. Again, this is that first step, setting up resting membrane potential. So on the x-axis, we have time, of course. Okay, so we've set up the resting membrane potential. That's fine. But we need to know what's happening when this cell gets excited, right? When we set this cell off, or the cell reaches a threshold around negative 55 millivolts. So what's step 2 in the cardiac myocyte action potential?
Depolarization.
Right. Okay. Step 2, depolarization. And we have this big thing here. So what causes step 2?
Is it because you have an influx of the sodium pouring into the cell?
Exactly correct, right? At threshold, we have these ion channels for sodium, and they're called fast ion channels. What that means is at threshold, these channels are opening up, but the sodium ion channels, because they're fast, are going to open up first. And what happens is we have a bunch of sodium entering the cell. If I have a bunch of positive charges entering the cell, what's going to happen to my potential? It's going to go up, right? It's going to move from negative towards positive. And in fact, it goes above positive, maybe to something like positive 30 millivolts. Okay. Yes.
Now, are the sodium coming in through a gated channel, or is it a chemical binding that's causing it?
It is a voltage-gated ion channel. What that means is, at a particular voltage, this channel opens up. Okay? That particular voltage is around negative 55 millivolts, and that's what we call threshold, right? Because if I have some sort of signal that causes my potential to reach threshold, well, now my sodium channels open up, and sodium starts flowing in, and that's where I get the depolarization of it. Yes, so voltage-gated. Now, step 3. Normally, in a regular skeletal muscle cell, we would be talking about repolarization. Okay, and what causes repolarization in a regular skeletal muscle cell? Right. Okay, so remember, we have these fast channels for sodium, and we have these slow channels for potassium. What that really means is they both open up at this stimulus, right? As soon as we reach threshold, both the sodium and potassium channels will be triggered to open. However, sodium's opening first because it's fast, potassium opens second because it's slow. Okay, and what's that going to do if I have a bunch of positive charges leaving the cell? It's going to make me go back negative. But remember, this isn't a skeletal muscle cell. This is a cardiac muscle cell. Okay, so not only are these potassium channels open, but we also have another channel open as well.
Calcium?
The calcium channel. Okay, so yes, the potassium's leaving, but also I now have calcium coming in. Okay, and potassium carries a positive charge, but calcium carries 2 positive charges. Right, so even though I have potassium leaving and calcium coming in at the same time, my calcium, which carries a positive 2 charge, is going to counteract all that potassium leaving. And so instead of going back down into the negative, what happens during this next phase? It's a plateau phase, right? We actually form this sort of plateau, right? It looks like this. And this is step 3. Finally, the sodium channels have been activated. The calcium channels also inactivate, and we're just left with a bunch of potassium leaving the cell. Okay, again, this is going to be responsible for repolarization, or movement back towards negative potential. Number 4, repolarization. Does everybody remember this? To some degree? Okay, and that's good, right? I'm glad that you guys knew what happens in a skeletal muscle cell. The easiest way to conquer this, what happens in a cardiac muscle cell, is to just compare them. We have the same step 1, the same step 2. Step 3 is where it starts to get a little hairy, right? Step 3, instead of just having potassium leave and repolarization of the cell, we have potassium leaving and calcium coming in. And because calcium is coming in with 2 positive charges, whereas potassium is leaving with 1, we end up with this plateau phase, or this extended area in the positive. Okay. Then, of course, step 4 is pretty much the same, right? After this calcium channel closes, the potassium's still leaking out, and therefore positive charges leave the cell, and we end up back in the negative through repolarization. Okay, so really it's very similar. 1, 2, and 4 are the same, but now we just have the addition of this third step, this plateau phase. So this is really good.
Professor McLean, I just wanna make sure I understand the plateau phase.
Yes.
Because we have so many calcium coming in, that's a positive charge. The cell is now positive, is that what you're saying?
Well,
And the potassium is leaving, is making it negative, but the calcium is making it positive?
right, exactly. It's always a balance, of course. But what's happening during step 3 is not only are these potassium channels open, but also the calcium channels. So positive charges are coming in, positive charges are leaving, and they cancel out, right? So instead of going towards negative or positive, you sort of see this plateau, right? It's sort of an area where we're just sort of up here at the same range as our first depolarization. Okay. That's really the difference. We just have a new channel that we're worried about, calcium channels, and it causes this plateau before repolarization. Yes?
So the calcium and sodium gates close before step 4?
They inactivate, so we don't have to get into this necessarily, but sodium channels and calcium channels have 3 stages of function. Okay, they're open, they're closed, and they're also inactivated. Okay, so at first they're all closed. What that means is they have the ability to open up, right? During resting membrane potential, they're both closed. But once we hit threshold, they open, and obviously you can see, ions are coming in, ions are leaving, that sort of stuff. But eventually, after a period of being open and in this positive range, they actually inactivate, which means that even though we're above threshold, they're closed. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's not necessarily that they're.
Just think of the inactive as closed, not open still.
Yeah, inactivated is still closed. But you can't possibly open it, because even though we're above threshold, it can't be opened, it's inactivated. Does that make sense? You don't need to know that for your exam.
So basically, to reach the threshold, the potassium has to go up.
To reach threshold, a various amount of things can happen. Really what you have to have is some positive charges coming in that can be caused by, of course in cardiac muscle cells we have gap junctions here, right? So I have a gap in between 2 cells. And let's just say this cell is a pacemaker cell. Okay, so this cell, we'll talk about what happens with pacemaker cells eventually, but at some point it'll go off, and that influx of positive charges, right, when it goes off, it has positive charges coming in, will then spread into this next cell. When it does that, it slightly raises this resting membrane potential to maybe threshold, and then once it hits threshold, now you have all these channels opening, now you have the action potential going off. Okay, so again, it's important to remember that all these cardiac muscle cells are connected by gap junctions, and eventually they'll connect to a pacemaker cell, right? One of them is connected to a pacemaker cell, and pacemaker cells are called pacemaker cells. Why? They set the pace, and how do they do that? What's a special characteristic about pacemaker cells and their potentials that's unlike any other cell? They don't have hyperpolarization necessarily, but they have a constant. They're constantly depolarizing, right? So let's talk about these next. This is exactly what I was going to get into, so kind of a good segue here. Again, okay. So again, we have our cardiac myocyte. And these cardiac myocytes are joined electrically and physically, right? We have these gap junctions here. I'm just going to put GJ. And we have desmosomes here. To pacemaker cells, right? Pacemaker cells. Now the electrical activity in a pacemaker cell is very similar to the activity in a cardiac myocyte. Really, they have the same setup. There's a lot of sodium and calcium outside, and there's a lot of potassium inside. But the difference is the channels we have, right? What channels are letting in what, and when they do that. So let's follow, a pacemaker cell. Again, my potential over here, 0 millivolts, negative 70 millivolts, maybe negative 55 millivolts, and time down here. Now, what's the first phase of a pacemaker potential? Do we have a resting membrane potential? No, it's never resting. That's what the point is right there. Instead of having a resting membrane potential, we have a pacemaker potential.
You should have said it.
This pacemaker potential is caused by always open sodium channels. These are leaky, always open sodium channels that never close, right? So sodium's always entering the cell, and if sodium's always entering the cell, instead of being a flat line, right, like you would normally expect for resting membrane potential, we have a pacemaker potential, which looks sort of like this. And this is step 1. Now, when we reach threshold, what happens? Step 2.
Depolarization.
Yeah, depolarization. Okay, this is similar to what we see with our cardiac myocyte. Except for this time, depolarization isn't caused by sodium entering the cell. We already have sodium entering the cell all the time. This time, depolarization is caused by calcium entering the cell. And then step 3, of course, repolarization. And that's when potassium's leaving the cell. So potassium's leaving this cell. And the calcium channel inactivates.
Can it be between negative 55 millivolts and less than that? Because the book says negative 40 millivolts.
Yeah,
Says it
I
it's
just
not a
use
threshold.
these terms as a loose action potential, but
I just want to make sure, like on the test, you don't have.
no, I won't ever ask you a specific number. I would just say, negative something. I wouldn't even say that, right? I'd never ask you a specific number. This is just to show you generally what's happening. So, there you go. Any other questions about this? Does everyone see the difference
So
between
the
this?
pacemaker, it just keep on going.
It keeps on going, right? These pacemaker cells, special characteristic, which we were talking about before, is autorhythmicity. Autorhythmicity means that they're rhythmically setting themselves off, right? Autorhythmicity. So over time, you have this pacemaker cell just setting off an action potential, setting off an action potential, setting off an action potential, if it's working properly, right? And that's why it's called a pacemaker cell, because eventually it will go off. And then that, this action potential will spread to other cardiomyocytes, and you have those cardiomyocytes going on interaction with the heart. All right, does everybody see this? Can everyone do this at home? Maybe? Okay, good. This is just a good way of practicing this concept, right? Drawing all these stuffs up, all the ions, and showing what's doing what when during the action potential of both a cardiomyocyte and a pacemaker cell.
So when someone has a pacemaker, it's because their heart isn't setting off these contractions, and that's why they insert a pacemaker?
Right, an artificial pacemaker would take the place of this guy. This guy's not working properly for whatever reason, so instead of, relying on it to work properly, you put in like a little machine that sets off the heart in an autorhythmic fashion.
So when that stops, the heart stops pumping because it's not contracting.
Right, if you're pacing, well, we talk about, there's multiple pacemakers in the heart, this is what we're gonna talk about next. One of them is obviously more important than the other, but you can survive with just using this is super important. Here we're talking about physical structures involved in the electrical stimulation and distribution of that electrical stimulation in the heart. Okay, so we have these various structures here. Everybody remember talking about all these structures? Okay, so the first structure here, the sinoatrial node, what does that do? What is the sinoatrial node? The sinoatrial node is the main pacemaker of the heart, okay? This is going to be because it depolarizes faster than any other cell in the heart. All these cells here are going to depolarize first because they depolarize more often, okay? And therefore we have impulses coming out of this sinoatrial node at about 75 times per minute. Okay, now it's the main pacemaker, but it lies all the way up here, right? Sort of in the top right corner of the heart. What that means is when this guy goes off, the atria are going to receive the electrical impulse first and go off first, right? We have atrial contraction first. Okay, then that, at the same time, really, this impulse is going to travel to this guy here. Does anybody know what this guy is? Yeah, this is the AV node, or atrioventricular node. This is also a pacemaker, however, we call it the backup pacemaker. Why? Well, the atrioventricular node has an inherent rate of 50 times per minute. What that means is it would go off, but it's already being stimulated by the sinoatrial node, right? So this guy is faster, and therefore is going to set off this guy before it even gets a chance to go off. All right, so back to your question, if we have some defect in the sinoatrial node, it's bad, obviously it's not great because our atria won't be contracting, but at the same time, we have a backup pacemaker here. Okay, this backup pacemaker is going to make sure your ventricles are contracting, your blood's still somewhat pumping, and maybe you can make it to the hospital before,
So you'll have a slow heart, because in a case like that, they would know one of those vests that you would wear, and it would like, make sure your heart is continuing. I know two people
Yeah.
whose heart, they had a similar situation, I don't know all the details, but their heart was just slowing down. And, they have to wear this vest so that if anything happens while they're sleeping and the heart doesn't, like the pacemaker they were saying doesn't set off,
Right.
it will automatically pump, like electrically charge their heart and get them pumping so that they can get to the hospital.
Right, well, yeah, exactly. So, it may be a vest, but there's also people who have literally electrical implants in their heart. I know somebody who has a thyroid problem, we'll talk about why thyroxine sort of affects heart rate and heart contraction, but he has a little thing in his heart, so if he ever enters atrial fibrillation, it actually shocks his heart and he can go to the hospital or whatever, I don't know. But, it's there to monitor the heart activity and then reset it if need be. So this is definitely something that they do. Anyways, continuing on, right? The sinoatrial node is going to send the impulses to the atria and to the AV node. Now the AV node is going to be important because, again, it's a backup pacemaker, but it also has another function. It's going to delay that impulse for 0.1 seconds. Okay, this is just enough time to let the atria finish contracting before the ventricles start to contract. All right, so you want to finish squeezing the top of the heart before you start squeezing the bottom of this heart and pushing blood out. Okay, so the atrioventricular node and the AV bundle are really the only connection point between the atria and the ventricles. Once it hits this AV bundle, also known as the bundle of His, that impulse actually gets sort of sped up. It gets shot down towards the bottom of the heart. Okay, this is done by the left bundle branch carrying it to the left side, the right bundle branch carrying it to the right side. Then we're going to start depolarization from bottom up, right? We're going to depolarize the outside bottom of the heart and move our way up. And again, this is for good reason. You want to start just like a tube of toothpaste, squeezing from the bottom up, right? This is going to push the most toothpaste out of your tube or the most blood out of your heart. Okay, so it's important that you also know all these different parts of involved in the sequence of excitation. For the exam. Any questions about that stuff? Again, this is all recaps, right? We got all the way to the electrocardiogram where we talked about these three different wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave, and what they refer to, right, what electrical activity is going on, which is what you're seeing on an EKG, right? The P wave, again, is responsible for atrial depolarization, right? Sort of showing you that the atria has depolarized. Then the QRS complex, we have two things happening simultaneously. That's why the QRS complex is not a neat wave, but a complex, right? So the two things happening here is atrial repolarization and at the same time ventricular depolarization, okay? So we get the relaxation of the atria, contraction of the ventricles, and then the T wave, right? The T wave, the last thing you'll see on an EKG, is responsible for ventricle repolarization. Everybody remember talking about this? So the EKG, again, a great way to monitor the electrical activity of the heart. If you're missing one of these waves on the EKG, it will tell you what's going on with the electrical activity in your heart. For example, this is normal sinus rhythm here. Here we have junctional rhythm. Junctional rhythm is where your SA node stops working, but of course your AV node keeps you going. And what's missing on the junctional rhythm? The P wave, right? That first wave. The P wave again corresponds to atrial depolarization. And the thing that's doing atrial depolarization is the SA node. If the SA node isn't working, you don't get the atrial depolarization, you don't get the P wave, and therefore you see what looks like this junctional rhythm. Okay, we also saw a second-degree heart block. This is heart block where some impulses are passing to the ventricles, but not all. So again, you see P waves that are sometimes followed by QRS complexes and a T wave, and you have P waves here which are not followed by any of that stuff. That means the electrical current did not get down to the ventricles of the heart.
When it says waves, QRS waves is mostly 2 to 1.
It should be 1 to 1, right? So the second degree heart block means that it ends up being 2 P waves for every 1 QRS complex, and that's because impulses are not getting through the AV node or the AV bundle, okay? But normally, of course, you have 1 to 1. Every P wave is followed by a QRS complex and a T wave. All right, so this is a great way to monitor the electrical activity of the heart, but we're going to move on, right? We're going to move on to the mechanical activity of the heart, and this is a little bit complex, just as the electrical activity is. So we'll get into this stuff extensively. Now, I guess the first thing we should talk about are heart sounds. Does anybody know what these heart sounds are? You know, when someone has a stethoscope, puts it on your chest, and they're listening for these heart sounds. What does that really correspond to? What are they listening for? Yeah, it's really the valves closing and opening, right? What they're hearing are these large changes in pressure differences as these valves close, like slam shut, and open, right? Normally people think it's like the heart beating, right? Loved up, like the atria and then the ventricles, and it kind of corresponds to that, but really what they're hearing are these valves closing. Okay, so we have 2 sounds associated with the closing of heart valves. This is that loved up, right? Has everybody heard of this before?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So the first sound, the lub, is as the AV valves close, right? So what's happening is at the beginning of ventricular contraction, we're increasing the pressure of the ventricles, and it slams those AV valves shut, and that's what you hear. The second sound, the dup sound, is as the SL valves close, or the semilunar valves close. Again, what you have is relaxation of the ventricles, and blood starts to flow backwards to the heart and slams those semilunar valves shut, and you get loved up. Now, what they're listening for is any abnormality in this heart sound. These are known as heart murmurs, okay? Really, these heart murmurs are letting you know that one or more valves is not working properly, okay? Either they're stiff or they're incompetent, right? And what you end up having is some sort of interruption in blood flow or interruption in these loved up sounds. And so this is where, they basically choose 4 points on your heart to maximize the way that they hear each of these 4 valves, right? And you can see where these positions are. Aortic valve here, pulmonary valve here, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but back to what we were talking about before, right? The mechanical activity of the heart. Okay, this is something that's sort of complex, but but again, we'll try to break it down and make it as easy as possible. Okay, so the cardiac cycle, this mechanical process of the heart is really just following blood flow through the heart during one complete heartbeat. One complete heartbeat consists of multiple phases, okay? These phases include atrial systole and diastole, followed by ventricular systole and diastole. Now, these are new words to you maybe, but systole really just refers to contraction. Diastole really refers to relaxation. So again, one complete heartbeat consists of atrial contraction and relaxation, followed by ventricular contraction and relaxation. Now, that's all fine and dandy. But what we're really talking about as we go through systole and diastole are volume and pressure changes. Okay, really blood flows through the heart down its pressure gradient, right? If I have a really high pressure in one area, blood's going to want to flow to areas of low pressure. Okay, the only thing preventing blood from flowing to areas of low pressure is sometimes these AV valves or SL valves, these valves. Right? So the valves are going to prevent backflow of blood, but in any other scenario, we have high pressure areas pushing blood into low pressure areas. Okay, so this is something that we really want to focus on. Does anybody know the relationship between volume and pressure? Anybody taken physics in here before?
The difference between volume and pressure?
The relationship between volume and pressure.
Volume
I
would
mean,
be the amount.
kind of common sense in a way, but I don't know.
Yeah, it is common sense, right? So even though I said physics and I'm about to say these things, Boyle's law, okay, Boyle's law really boils down to, nah, I didn't mean to do that. Pressure is inversely related to volume, okay? What this means is when I have an increase in volume, I have a decrease in pressure. And when I have a decrease in volume, I have an increase in pressure. Okay, does everybody understand that? When I'm talking about the heart, really all it can do is change its volume of any particular chamber. When I have ventricular contraction or systole, what's happening is the volume of that ventricle is getting smaller. And therefore what happens to the pressure inside that ventricle? It goes up, right? So this is sort of the way we want to think about the mechanical activities of the heart as we go through it. Now this is not going to be on your exam. But it's a cool way, not a cool way, but helpful way to think about the mechanical activities of the heart. Whenever I have volume decreasing, I have pressure increasing. Whenever I have volume increasing, I have pressure decreasing, right? Systole, all right, systole equals volume decreasing, right? When I have contraction, really what I'm doing is decreasing the size of my chamber. When I have diastole, what I'm talking about is increasing volume. And of course, these have pressure-related consequences. So again, nice to think about as we go through the different mechanical activities in the heart. Okay, so let's start that now. The first phase of the cardiac cycle is known as ventricular filling. Take a sip of water. Okay. The first phase of the cardiac cycle is known as ventricular filling. During ventricular filling, the ventricles are in diastole, or they're relaxed. And what that means is their volume goes up and their pressure goes down. So where do you think blood is flowing to during ventricular filling? Right, they're flowing into the ventricles. This is the phase where the ventricles are getting filled with blood, right? Ventricular filling. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, the pressure in our atria are larger than the pressure in our ventricles, so the AV valves are open and blood is flowing down into the ventricles. Now, 80% of this blood flows passively, right? 80% of the ventricles fill just by blood going from high pressure to low pressure, but at the end of this phase, we have atrial systole, right? We have contraction of the atria, which is going to deliver the remaining 20% of blood, right? Basically squeezing as much blood as we possibly can into these ventricles. Now, at the end of ventricular filling, we get this first volume which we're concerned with. This is known as end diastolic volume, or the volume in the ventricles at the end of relaxation. This is going to be the most blood that the ventricles will ever have in them at one time. The next phase is exactly what you think. After we've filled the ventricles, now we enter ventricular systole. Okay, again, ventricular systole means what?
That the volume's going down, pressure's going up.
Right, the ventricles start to contract. That means the chamber's volume goes down, and the pressure starts to go way, way up. Okay, so we're about to squeeze a bunch of blood out of these ventricles. Okay? Now, during ventricular systole, the atria are relaxed, and again, the ventricles begin to contract. And again, this contraction leads to a rise in pressure. The rise in pressure is going to slam those AV valves shut, and this is where we get that first sound, love dub, right? So the rise in ventricular pressure slams the AV valves shut, and therefore blood's not going to go from the ventricles back into the atria, but now it's going from the ventricles towards the great vessels. Okay? Once we close those AV valves, we enter a period called the isovolumetric contraction phase. What this means is we're contracting, but our volume's not changing, right? Because all the valves are closed, right, the blood has nowhere to go. Okay? After this isovolumetric contraction phase, we enter the ejection phase. Okay? This is where the pressure in the ventricles rises above the pressure in the great vessels, and therefore blood is flowing from where to where? Again, high pressure to low pressure. So if I have high pressure in my ventricles above the pressure in my great vessels, then it's going to push the blood out into the great vessels, right? Basically ejecting the blood from the heart. In order to do this, of course, it has to open up the semilunar valves. Okay? Now at the end of ejection phase, we get the second volume which we're concerned with, this end systolic volume. Okay? This is the volume of blood remaining in each ventricle after systole. Again, this is going to be the lowest amount of blood that your ventricles ever have in them, right? This is after we've squeezed all the blood out, okay, RESV. Now the final phase of the cardiac cycle is something known as the isovolumetric relaxation. Okay? During this phase, we start diastole, right? This is where the ventricles begin to relax. Okay, so because the ventricles begin to relax, again, their volume is going up, the pressure is going down, blood's going to want to flow back into the ventricles from the great vessels, but it's not going to, right? Because we stop the backflow of blood with, this time, the semilunar valves. Okay. At the end of again, it's called isovolumetric relaxation because all valves are shut. But at the end of isovolumetric relaxation, we have the atrial pressure rising above the ventricle pressure yet again. That forces the AV valves open, and again, blood starts to flow into the ventricles, and we start all over, right? We go back to ventricular filling. Now, I understand this is a lot to sort of focus on, especially when it's just words. So this is why we have this graph, right? Which is way clearer, maybe. I guess not. All right, but that's okay. It's a complicated graph, but we'll go through it step by step and talk about what's happening at each step. Okay. So the first thing we look at the top here are the electrocardiogram readout and the heart sounds. Okay, that's cool to know, but not really what we focus on. Here we see the pressure. Okay, and this is talking about the pressure of 3 different areas. Okay, we're talking about the left side of the heart only here. We have the pressure for the left atrium, which is shown here in pink. We have the pressure for the left ventricle, which is shown here in blue. And then we have the pressure for the great vessel of the left side, which is the aorta, which is shown here in green. Okay. Finally, we have this ventricular volume down here. Okay. This ventricular volume, again, is showing you how much blood is left in the ventricles after diastole and after systole. So let's step through, let's go through this process one by one. What's cool about this graph is when we look at the pressure area of this graph, what we see is that every time where one pressure crosses another pressure, we have a valve opening or closing. Okay, again, what we're referring to here is whenever the left ventricular pressure crosses the left atrial pressure or the aortic pressure, we have some sort of valve opening or some sort of valve closing. Okay, So this is much easier to visualize here. So again, phase one. Okay? During phase one, we have ventricular filling. So what's happening? Our AV valves are open. Our atrial pressure here is above our ventricular pressure, right? Everybody sees that the atrial pressure is higher than the ventricular pressure. So where's blood going to flow? Again, blood is going to flow down its pressure gradient from high pressure to low pressure. Right, to the ventricles. If I have high pressure in the atria, relatively speaking, if I have higher pressure in the atria than I do in the ventricles, again, blood is going to flow from the atria into the ventricles. It wants to flow down its pressure gradient, just like everything would flow down its pressure gradient. Okay, so again, phase one, ventricular filling, my atrial pressure is higher than my ventricular pressure, and therefore blood is flowing from the atria into the ventricles. Now phase two, where I have the start of ventricular systole. What's happening now? Well, I'm starting to contract the ventricles, so again, the volume's going down. My pressure is going way up. It actually shoots way up. Everybody sees this blue line. Okay. The first thing it causes is the atrial pressure. Okay. And again, whenever I have these pressures crossing each other, what I have is the opening or closing of some valve. Okay. So what valve is opening or closing when my ventricular pressure rises above my atrial pressure? Right, the AV valve, okay, the mitral valve, you're right, bicuspid valve on the left side of the heart. But in general, the AV valves, right? As soon as my ventricular pressure goes above my atrial pressure, where's blood going to want to flow? Right, it's going to want to go back into the atria, and we know that's not where blood flows. We have these AV valves here that will slam shut and prevent flow backwards, right? Backwards flow into the atria. Okay, so this is happening here. Now, the ventricular pressure then enters a phase of isovolumetric contraction. Okay, from here to here, both of my valves are closed. And so even though I'm increasing the pressure, or increasing contraction, my volume's not changing, right? It can't change because the valves are closed. It's not until my ventricular pressure rises above my aortic pressure that what happens? Right, that semilunar valve opens, and again, blood is going to flow down its pressure gradient from the ventricle to the aorta. Okay, everybody sees that? Okay. This is phase two, right, where I have ventricular contraction. This first phase, the first part of phase two would be the isovolumetric contraction phase, and then I have the ejection phase, where I'm actually pushing blood out of the heart into the aorta, right, out of the left ventricle into the aorta. Okay. Now that happens for a while, and eventually, we run out of blood in the ventricles, and so the pressure starts to come back down. And again, we see that the pressure in the ventricles sort of goes below the aorta, and therefore what happens? Where's blood going to want to flow if my ventricular pressure is now lower than my aortic pressure?
It's going to want to come back in.
It's going to want to come back in, and we don't want that. So again, here is where that semilunar valve closes, and you can see it relates to this second sound of the heart. Again, the first sound is during AV valve closing. Second sound is the semilunar valve closing, right? So you get that flubbed up, right? Okay, so as ventricular pressure goes below aortic pressure, now I have that semilunar valve closing. Well, again, my semilunar valve is closed here. My atrioventricular valve is still closed. So I have a period of isovolumetric relaxation where the volume isn't changing, but my pressure is going down. At the end of this isovolumetric relaxation, my ventricular pressure finally goes below my atrial pressure yet again. Okay? So, what happens when my ventricular pressure goes below my atrial pressure?
More blood comes in.
The AV valves open, the atria start letting blood flow into the ventricles, and we start ventricular filling all over again. Right? So again, it's a cycle, so we go from 1, 2 to 3, and then start back at 1. But these are the mechanical events happening in the heart, right? We have first atrial systole, where we squeeze blood into the heart during ventricular filling. Then we have ventricular systole, where the pressure is increasing, the AV valves close, the semilunar valve slams open, and we start ejecting blood from the heart during the ejection phase here in yellow. And then the ventricular pressure again begins to dive. Once it goes below the aortic pressure, the semilunar valve closes, and we end up with isovolumetric relaxation until it dips below the atrial pressure, where we begin ventricular filling all over again. Now, I understand this is a lot to follow, but this graph has it all, right? We can look at not just the pressure, but also ventricular volume. Again, we have two volumes that we're concerned with, the end-diastolic volume and the end-systolic volume. The end-diastolic volume refers to the volume in the ventricles after diastole, or after relaxation, after ventricular filling. Again, this is the most blood your heart will, or your ventricles will ever have in it. Okay, this is EDV. Then we start ventricular contraction and ejection, right? This yellow part is the ejection phase. And during the ejection phase, you can see that that volume in the ventricles is decreasing, right? We're pushing blood out of the ventricles into the aorta until we reach the end of systole, or the end of contraction, and we end up with this second volume, ESV, end-systolic volume. Not only that, but we can look up here to the EKG, which is the P, QRS, and T waves, again corresponding to atrial contraction, ventricular contraction and atrial depolarization, and then ventricular depolarization, and we have the heart sounds here as well, again referring to the closing of the AV valves and the closing of the semilunar valves. Yes, you have a
Is
question?
the ventricular volume, is that directly related to like blood pressure? The EDV and ESV?
We will talk about this in chapter 19.
Okay, sorry.
But no, it's fine, it's a good question. So what happens is you can see that the aorta sort of catches all that pressure, right? As the ventricle starts ejecting blood into the aorta, their pressures become the same, right? They're basically one connected tube. Okay, the aorta catches all that pressure, and then as the ventricle goes back down, that semilunar valve closes, and the aorta actually maintains the pressure. Okay, so when we talk about blood pressure, really it's a product of the aorta. The aorta sort of expands because it's very elastic. It's called an elastic artery. It's the largest elastic artery. So it expands and catches all that pressure, and then when the semilunar valve closes, it continually recoils and keeps the pressure going. Okay, this will give you what's known as mean arterial pressure, and that mean arterial pressure is really what you consider blood pressure. But yeah, you can see that the aorta is jumping in between 120 and 80 there, right? This is your pulse pressure, right? 120 is systolic pressure over diastolic pressure, which is normally 80, right? Whenever they take your blood pressure, what they're looking at is actually pressure in the aorta as it opens and closes, as that semilunar valve opens and closes. Okay. But yeah, this is all visible here. It's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah.
And one last thing that we haven't talked about yet, this wasn't complicated enough, is this thing, the dichrotic notch. Okay, the dichrotic notch is a brief rise in aortic pressure due to the backflow of blood onto the semilunar valve. Okay, so you see this left ventricle during ejection, the pressures match, but then when the left ventricle goes below the aortic pressure and the semilunar valve closes, now you have this backflow of blood onto the semilunar valve, and that briefly causes this dichrotic notch here, right? This increase in aortic pressure after the semilunar valve closes. Any questions about this? I know it's a lot, but if you can follow each of these graphs all the way through, I promise you it'll be very helpful in the exam, right? It's a very useful graph. I forget what it's called, but whoever came up with it is a pretty famous guy.
Systolic notch is increase in blood pressure.
Yeah, it's an increase in the aortic blood pressure. When the semilunar valve closes, basically that semilunar valve slams shut because blood is pushing back into the heart, and then when that blood gets stopped by the semilunar valve, it pushes out on the blood vessel walls, right, and causes this brief increase in pressure before smoothing out again. All right, no questions, really? Okay, we'll continue on. One of the reasons we talk about this stuff is because we want to monitor something known as cardiac output. Now, cardiac output is defined as the volume of blood pumped by each ventricle in 1 minute. So in order to understand our cardiac output, again, we've got to think about how much blood is actually leaving the heart. So in order to do this, we need to calculate what's known as stroke volume, or the volume of volume of blood ejected from the heart with each stroke or each beat. Okay. Stroke volume can be calculated by taking your end-diastolic volume, again, the most blood your ventricle will ever have in it after relaxation, and subtracting your end-systolic volume. Okay, this is the least amount of blood your ventricles will ever have in it, right? After contraction. You can see that end-systolic volume is not zero. Okay, you don't completely void the heart of all the blood, or the ventricles of all the blood. So you have this difference, right? From 120 to 50, EDV minus ESV is your stroke volume. Now that's one part of the equation, right? The stroke volume is just the volume of blood pumped out by one ventricle with each beat. The other part of the equation, of course, is your heart rate, right? We want to know pumped by each ventricle in 1 minute. So we have to know how many times the heart is pumping every minute, okay? So this is what the heart rate is, number of beats per minute. So these two things together will give you your cardiac output. And normally your cardiac output is around 5 liters per minute. That's quite a lot of blood. So at rest, again, normally you're talking about 5 liters of blood per minute. However, cardiac output increases when we affect both heart rate or stroke volume, or both. Okay, your maximal cardiac output might be 4 to 5 times your resting cardiac output in non-athletic people, but maybe 7 times your normal cardiac output in trained athletes, right? They have the ability to increase the amount of blood which they're pumping through their heart just because they do it all the time, right? They train their heart to be efficient when we talk about increasing heart rate and stroke volume. Okay, this difference between your maximal cardiac output and your resting cardiac output is known as your cardiac reserve, basically how much your heart can pump more if needed. So again, we'll draw this up on the board, some more equations. Can I erase some of this, or all of this? Where is this? My cardiac output is directly related to 2 things, my heart rate and my stroke volume. My stroke volume, again, we calculate by taking our end-diastolic volume and subtracting our end-systolic volume. Okay, what's the end-diastolic volume again?
Is it contraction?
Amount of blood after relaxation. Again, after you're done with ventricular filling, your ventricle has been filled the largest amount it will ever be filled. We're talking about your EDV, end-diastolic volume, how much blood you have in the heart or the ventricles right before you start ejecting it. Okay. End-systolic volume is amount of blood after contraction, or at the end of systole. All right, that makes sense. This is, again, how much blood is left in the heart after you've ejected all the blood you're going to eject. Okay, so the most blood that your heart will ever have versus the littlest amount of blood your heart will ever have. This is going to give you how much blood you're pumping per beat. And this can be affected by 3 different things. 3 main factors that affect our stroke volume. These factors are known as preload, contractility, and afterload. So in order to monitor cardiac output, we should know what affects our heart rate and what affects our stroke volume, and specifically we should know these 3 things are affecting our stroke volume. We'll get into the things that affect heart rate a little bit later. Okay. So, has anybody heard of these 3 terms? Preload, contractility, or afterload? Okay, that's fine, that's why we're here. So preload is really just the same thing as EDV. Okay. Preload is the degree of stretch of cardiac muscle cells before they contract. Okay, this relies on something known as the Frank-Starling mechanism. Has anybody heard of this Frank-Starling mechanism? You maybe heard of it in skeletal muscle chapter in AP1, but maybe not. what the Frank-Starling mechanism suggests is that there's an optimal degree in which the muscles can be stretched, right? At this optimal point, we have the most actin myosin cross bridges, and therefore, at a certain degree of stretch, we have stronger contraction than at a lesser degree. And this is what we see, right? If I have more preload, right, more degree of stretch of cardiac muscle cells, I see that my cardiac muscle actually contracts harder, right? It contracts more to get rid of that extra blood. Okay? Again, cardiac muscle exhibits a length-tension relationship, or we can generate more tension at different lengths or larger lengths. At rest, cardiac muscle cells are shorter than optimal length. So again, as they fill, we move closer and closer to this optimal stretch. This optimal degree of stretch is going to cause a harder contraction, and therefore a larger stroke volume, right? Increasing the amount of blood I squeeze out of this heart. Now, the most important factor influencing preload is venous return. Okay, venous return is basically how much blood is coming back into the heart through the veins. The more blood we have returning to the heart from the veins, obviously the higher our preload and the higher our stroke volume. Now, this next concept, contractility, is fairly simple, right? This is talking again about how much the heart contracts, but this time we're not reliant on this length-tension relationship. Now we're talking about outside agents which can affect the amount of contraction or tension that your heart generates. Okay, so contractility is defined as the contractile strength at given muscle length, independent of muscle stretch and EDV. Okay, like I said. So muscle contractility can be increased by sympathetic stimulation. This is something we've talked about before, and positive inotropic agents. Okay, these are all different substances which cause the heart to contract harder. Okay, thyroxine, glucagon, epinephrine. These are all hormones that you find in the body. Epinephrine, of course, being adrenaline, right? So everybody realizes that adrenaline is going to increase your cardiac output, as well as high extracellular calcium. Right? Why might high extracellular calcium affect your contractility of the heart? Right, it still relies on the influx of calcium. If I have more calcium, then I'm going to have more calcium. If I have more calcium outside the cell, then I have more calcium coming in when those channels open, and therefore a longer and stronger action potential or plateau phase of action potential. Okay, so contractility is increased by these different things. It's decreased by negative inotropic agents. Okay, and we mentioned one before, this calcium channel blocker. Again, it has the exact opposite of effect of high extracellular calcium. Here we're preventing calcium from entering the cell, and therefore we have a less strong contraction, a shorter plateau phase. Also things like acidosis and extracellular potassium.
And those positive inotropic agents, what's digitalis?
Digitalis is, it's like a plant that they use medically, right? I don't really know much about it, but they harvest these digitalis plants, and they make like Digitalex or something out of it, and it's a positive inotropic agent that they give clinically, right, for people with some sort of maybe atrial fibrillation or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Same right now. Same right now. Digitalis. Good. I can make whatever I want up. No, it seriously is like a plant, and they look like fingers, so that's why they call them digitalis or finger-like. Any other questions about this? Continuing on, this is what that might look like. Again, when we're talking about contractility of the heart, it all comes down to how much calcium we get inside the heart cell. Right? So anything that would increase the amount of calcium entering the heart is going to be a positive inotropic agent, right? Something that's causing greater contractions. Anything that decreases the amount of calcium getting into the heart, again, like a calcium channel blocker, is going to be a negative inotropic agent or something that causes less strong contractions. Okay. Continuing on. The last factor influencing stroke volume is something we know as afterload. Afterload is defined as the pressure the ventricles must overcome to eject the blood. Okay, again, when we go back here, this aortic pressure is at some level. The higher that aortic pressure, the higher the ventricular pressure must reach in order to open up the semilunar valve and eject blood. If this pressure is higher, we say the afterload is increased. If the pressure is lower, then we say the afterload is decreased. Or basically, again, the amount of pressure that the ventricle has to overcome or surpass in order to eject blood from the heart. Okay. So back here. Okay. What kind of things influence afterload? Well, obviously, any sort of hypertension or increase in blood pressure is going to increase the afterload. Again, what causes or what happens is less blood is ejected, so our ESV goes up, and our stroke volume goes down, and our cardiac output therefore goes down. Any questions about afterload? Or these three factors influencing the heart? Okay, we have here this nice graph which is showing you where some of these things fit in, okay? We can talk about contractility. Contractility directly is related to the in-stroke volume, right? Or in-systolic volume. If my contractility goes up, I'm squeezing harder and I'm ejecting more blood, right? So we can sort of draw up this relationship here. What kind of things increase my contractility again? My contractility.
The hormones.
Right, we have positive inotropic agents. This is going to increase contractility, and negative inotropic agents. This decreases contractility. If I affect contractility, again, it's inversely related to my ESV, right? So 1 over ESV. If my contractility goes up, what's going to happen to my in-systolic volume? It's going to go down, right? If I squeeze harder, I'm squeezing more blood out of my ventricles, and therefore I have less blood at the end of systole. So if my contractility goes up, my ESV goes down, my stroke volume goes up. All right, everybody sees this? On the exam, I will ask you what kind of effect on the cardiac output a positive inotropic agent might have. Okay, again, you have to know that it would affect contractility, which is going to affect ESV in a negative way. And that ESV, because I have a smaller number being subtracted from my EDV, I have a larger stroke volume and therefore an increase in cardiac output. All right, does everyone see the way that you can follow this logically? Okay, let's use another example. My afterload, right? Let's say I have hypertension, right? I can't stop eating McDonald's, and I have arteriosclerosis. My arteries are sort of smaller because of all this fatty plaque buildup, and therefore my afterload is increased. What's going to happen to my ESV?
You're not going to have less of a contractility or a stronger one?
Well, I'm not worried about contractility right now, but just afterload.
ESV is going to increase.
Yeah, if my afterload increases, again, what is afterload?
The
We just talked about it.
Magnetic, so
Or the
eject
pressure
it
has
from
to
the
overcome
heart.
to-
Right. Let's go back here. If the pressure my heart has to overcome to eject blood is higher, that means I'm going to be ejecting less blood. Okay? So my ESV doesn't go down, but instead it goes up, right? Because I'm squeezing less blood out of this heart with each contraction. And therefore, I see my stroke volume goes up or down. If I'm subtracting by a larger number,
Goes down?
it goes down. My stroke volume goes down, my cardiac output goes down, right? In fact, if you have such bad hypertension, chronic hypertension, eventually your cardiac output will be so low that you can't sustain life. And this is what causes heart attacks or strokes or other things related to cardiovascular problems. Okay, so you want to definitely know how each of these things affects stroke volume, and then eventually overall how it affects cardiac output. During the review, we can go over a million examples, but let's continue on for now. Okay, so the next thing we'll talk about is regulation of the heart rate itself. Again, we're not talking about changing the stroke volume here, but now we're talking about things that affect the heart rate, okay, which is again beats per minute. We really have two factors here. They can be broken down into these two groups, right? Positive chronotropic factors, these are things that are going to increase the heart rate, and negative chronotropic factors, these are things that decrease the heart rate. Okay. The best increaser of heart rate that we have is the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, this will, the sympathetic nervous system that you should have talked about in AMP1 is activated whenever you come into contact with some sort of stress or exercise, right? The way that the sympathetic nervous system works on the heart is that it releases norepinephrine and epinephrine, or noradrenaline and adrenaline. You've obviously heard of adrenaline before. This norepinephrine will cause your pacemakers to fire more quickly, right, more rapidly. And it also increases contractility, but we're not worried about that because we're just talking about heart rate. Okay, so here we're talking about causing the pacemakers to fire more rapidly and therefore increasing your heart rate. Again, positive chronotropic factor. Our negative chronotropic factor is still the autonomic nervous system, but this time we're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, this time we're talking about releasing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and acetylcholine has the exact opposite effect on the heart. Instead of speeding up the heart rate, acetylcholine is going to hyperpolarize pacemaker cells and therefore slow the heart rate down, okay, making it harder to reach threshold by taking this potential lower hyperpolarization. Again, something you probably should have learned in AMP1 is that the parasympathetic nervous system does not innervate cardiac muscle cells and therefore cannot affect contractility. Okay. And again, this is probably the best review graph for these two concepts, right? Here we have cardiac output. Cardiac output is affected by two things, your heart rate and your stroke volume. Here are all the things that affect stroke volume. Here are all the things that affect heart rate. And so you want to know all these different things in case I ask you about them on an exam. Does anybody have any questions about this stuff? Okay, I think this is a good place to stop for now. I know there's like 7 or 8 minutes left. If you have any questions about this stuff, please come ask me. Otherwise, on Thursday, what we'll do is we'll finish up, right?